The 2025 VCT Pacific season is just upon us. We're about 2 weeks out from the start of the season, so now it's time to preview the entire VCT 12-team league. Going through all 12 teams, talking about the changes they made in the offseason, talking about how good they're going to do next year or how bad they're going to do. There's a lot of skill in this region, a lot of changes to rosters that maybe some people expected or didn't expect. So it's time to go through all of them. Let's get into it. So this is the board we have today. Just like the America season preview that I did, we will be starting with the top left, which means we are starting with T1, team that I think is going to be very good this year. In terms of players that they lost, they get rid of Saya player, Rossi, and Accurate, or Excurate, however you say it. In terms of players, they added some real big hitters here. You get Buzz, formerly of DRX, Meteor, formerly of Gen.G, and Sylvan, a tier 2 player that they picked up. So this team got some of the biggest fish in the entire VCT Pacific offseason available. Getting Buzz and Meteor looked like two fantastic additions, as well as halfway through the year they picked up Stacks after he was dropped from DRX. So T1 doing a really good job at grabbing players that are very talented, are very good, that just could not stay on the teams that they were previously on. And these players definitely have a lot to prove. Buzz was a part of a DRX roster that looked very good for a long time, and Buzz was a great part of it. Unfortunately, due to some inconsistencies by both Buzz and the team at large, the team never really could get things going. So now he moves on to a different team in T1, one of the biggest organizations in esports, and so far it's looked like a great fit. You have Stocks, you have Meteor, you have Buzz, you have Sylvan, you have the players that you kept in both Carpe and Aizu, Carpe probably being the sub there. Their best placement in 2024 last year was 3rd at stage 1. They had a pretty mediocre stage 1. They only won 2 games during the round robin stage, but because of the rest of their group being pretty bad overall, they were able to make it into the playoff bracket, and they were able to have a pretty good run during that playoff and make 3rd to qualify for Master Shanghai. Unfortunately, they did not go very far in that tournament. They lost during that Swiss stage, and T1 being an organization that really likes winning in esports, they do a lot of it in League of Legends. They did not feel the need to run it back because clearly something wasn't working. So now they built a team that so far looks quite good. If we're just going off their offseason results, this team should be very good. They only lost 1 match in the entire offseason so far, and that was a 1-map game to Zeta Division, so that's just an upset. That is a 1-map match. I don't know if that game goes to 3 maps if Zeta wins that, but the team looks to be firing on all cylinders. They look primed to be one of, if not the best teams in the entire Pacific, and to contend for international trophies. But we have seen super teams get built and then crumble when things matter most. So Team 1 is going to hope that, especially with the amount of changes and probably amount of money that they invested in these players, that does not happen to them, and I'm pretty confident in their chances. This is definitely, I think, one of the top 3 teams in the Pacific. Moving on to a team that definitely last year was top 3, if not the best team in the entire Pacific League, especially considering they won an international tournament. We have Gen.G, who only swapped out 2 players in their roster, but 2 pretty important players, or at least one of them incredibly important. They lost Meteor to T1, who I just talked about, and they also did not bring back Lakia, who for some reason does not have a roster. So in terms of replacements, they brought in Foxy9, previously of DRX, and Yeoman. He's coming over from Korean Tier 2. He comes from the team Nongshim Redforce. No, not the team that we're going to talk about later, the team that they had previously. In terms of their best placement in 2024, as I already said, they did win an international tournament. They got 1st at VCT Masters Shanghai, marking so far the only international trophy win by a Pacific team. It took a long time for this region to finally win a trophy, and Gen.G being the ones to do it. They were one of the most dominant teams last year, so it did make a lot of sense. Unfortunately, while losing 2 players and swapping out 2 new ones, that should be something that is replaceable, but they're losing Meteor, who is an incredible player. He's very good in the clutch. He can win like 1v3s, 1v2s just very easily. You're losing one of the best Sentinel players in the world, and you're bringing in Foxy9, who has had a very inconsistent career up until this point. He was in and out of the DRX roster until finally getting a permanent spot last year, and he did not impress them enough to have them bring him back. So I think that is a loss that they're definitely going to end up missing in the offseason. I don't think Foxy9 or Yeoman is going to be enough to be the sum of 1 Meteor. But that doesn't mean they can't perform well. Maybe with this new opportunity on this new organization, Foxy9 thrives, and maybe Yeoman ends up being a pleasant surprise on that initiator role. These are parts that could work. I still think this team is very good. I think I have a lot more hope than what I've seen seen other people talking about this team, but what I will say is I think they've gone from a tournament contender to just a contender to qualifying for the tournaments. I think they're definitely going to make it there. They definitely are one of the better teams in this region, but without that X factor in Meteor, you're going to be missing that, and it might take a bit to adjust. So I think they're still definitely in the top half of the Pacific, probably top 3, and their offseason was pretty up and down, but they still got a lot of wins, especially at that Soup League tournament where despite an early loss to Sentinels, they did make it to Grand Finals where they did lose to Energy, but still a pretty impressive road to get there. They got the rematch win on Sentinels, they beat DRX, they beat Talon. So yes, they did lose some big pieces, but they still have some huge pieces in Texture, who's one of the best duelist players in the entire world. Cameron was one of the best rookies in the entire VCT last season, and they found a way to keep their IGL in Munchkin. So this is still a fantastic team, just are they able to win tournaments? That is going to be a big question for this new version of Gen.G, especially after last year. Moving on, we have Talon, a team that didn't make any sweeping roster changes, keeping what they had at the end of last year. Only technically losing Patafan in the offseason, but he hasn't played for a year. He was a sub on this team, and they didn't make any additions. A big addition that they did make at the end of last season was bringing in Primi for the Stage 2 playoffs as well as Champions. That little gamble card did end up working, and their best placement of 2024 ended up being those playoffs, 4th at the Stage 2 playoffs. So this team did kind of come out of nowhere by picking up Primi and being able to qualify for Champions, but it didn't put them on the map as one of the best teams in the world. They had a mediocre performance at Champions, running into Leviathan and Team Vitality and not being able to get a single map off of either of those teams. However, it was still a good experience for some of their younger players, especially Primi, who had just gotten in and all of a sudden he's at Champions. And Primi definitely has a long way to go. He is a ranked player that was just thrown into this team, and he's going to have to learn more of the difference between pro play and ranked, but he clearly has incredible skill, and I think that if he just works on those things, he's going to be able to translate it to a pro player, and clearly Talon has a lot of faith in him. And they also still have Jip Boys, they got Cruz, they got Governor, they got Ban. These are some solid players on this team, and there's a reason why they were able to pick a Primi in the first place and be able to make it to Champions. This is a pretty well-rounded team overall. I see them having more potential than what they've shown thus far, but maybe this is the start of something great for them. I don't know if I see them making it to international tournaments over some of the other teams. However, it is possible. There definitely are a lot of unknowns when it comes to this region, so maybe Talon having the roster that was pretty good last year, maybe being able to build off of that, especially with your new guy in Primi, maybe that is what is best. Moving on, we have DRX, a team that went through quite a bit of change in the offseason, and it's definitely questionable as to whether or not it was necessary or not. As previously stated, they lost Buzz, who was their duelist player. They also lost Bane, who they brought in halfway through the season last year, and Foxy9. In terms of replacements, they end up bringing Freen, Hyunmin, and Athen into the roster. Athen was on their prospect team, DRX Prospects, and Hyunmin was a ranked demon who also played a little bit of tier 2. Hyunmin will be their new duelist player. Seems like Freen is going to be playing Initiator, and then Athen seems to be either Sentinel or Initiator Flex. So as I was talking about earlier when I talked about Buzz, this DRX team was a team that looked really good for a long time, but just could not win a tournament. They are the Korean version of Paper X, where they just had a roster that was together for very long, including a coaching staff that is still there. Previously, they were known as Vision Strikers. That team was really good, but again, did not do well internationally. So they were hitting the nail on the head for a long time. A lot of people saying that they should fire the coach, that they should make roster changes. I probably would have preferred them to go more in the changing coaches route than to make a mostly rebuild, because now the only player left from that previous team is Mako, who is a fantastic player. I don't know if he's going to be this team's IGL this year, but that seems to be the case, which he seems to be pretty good at, but he doesn't seem to want to do it, so I do question that decision overall. They kicked Zest and RB off the roster before the beginning of the season, and then they made roster changes halfway through the season. They brought in Bane mid-season, and it didn't seem like he impressed his coaching staff enough. And in terms of their best placement in 2024, it was a 5th to 6th placement at Champions. So while they did go through roster changes and it seemed like this team just wasn't what it used to be, they still were able to rally and get enough champion points to qualify for that Champions tournament and do pretty well in there. I just question making this big of a roster change. I understand that there's a lot of really good young talent in Korea, and Korea is very good at developing esports players at a young age. So maybe these changes end up being beneficial, but I don't know if this puts them into the category of being able to win a tournament like they've been trying to get to for a very long time. But we will see. They should still be in at least the top half of the Pacific, but will they be able to qualify for tournaments and compete for those trophies? I'm not super confident in that, but it's possible. Moving on, we have Zeta Division, a team that made 3 big roster changes this offseason. In terms of players they lost, they lose Laz to retirement, Uran, who didn't have a great season, as well as Hiroron. And the players they added, they bring in 3 players from the Tier 2 team in Fennel. That is CLZ, Soyota, and XDLL. Hope I'm saying any of those right. So Zeta's been around for a long time, being a Japanese team in the VCT. They were around during the pre-franchising days, being able to qualify for international tournaments, but only really do damage at that Reykjavik 2022 one. And now for the past 2 years, they've been one of the worst teams in the Pacific region. They've been either okay or pretty bad, with their best placement being 6th at kickoff. That's not a good sign for how the rest of their 2024 went. So they're bringing in these new Tier 2 players to hopefully jumpstart this roster. They had a pretty decent performance at the APAC qualifier for the Red Bull Homeground event. They just ran into T1. And at the Riot Games 1 Invitational, they were able to beat Leviton and DFM in 1-map games, but they did lose to Fnatic. So I would hope that going from a team that was pretty decent to a team that was just bad overall in 2024. I would hope that would motivate the players that are still around from previous rosters to really be motivated to have a good year. Depp and Sugar Zero are the 2 remaining players from last year's roster, and there's a reason why they're pretty talented. Don't know if they're going to be able to break into that top 5, top 4 in the region, but I would say that they have one of the better chances in what I would consider the kind of mid-pack of the Pacific. Moving on, we have Team Secret, who in terms of roster changes didn't do anything. They did have some mid-season changes by kicking off Gen.G and bringing in Wild Oreo, as well as a player into GE, and they made those changes because their overall performance in 2024 was not good. Their best placement was 5th at kickoff in the same playing round that Zeta Division was. This team in years past has been kind of a weird team because when they're facing teams that are seemingly around the same skill level on paper as them, they tend to lose, but when they're playing teams that should be better than them, like PaperX in Stage 1, they're able to beat them for some reason. So they're a team that is pretty good at playing spoiler to some of those better teams, but can't put together a consistent enough game to be successful. So we don't know if going from a roster that was inconsistent and was basically in the basement of the Pacific for most of the year, I don't know if taking that roster and just running it back is necessarily a good decision. While you can look at teams like Talon, who are doing a run it back from last year type of roster, I think that there's a lot more promise in a team like that, whereas Team Secret, I really just don't see it. They didn't make any changes, and I think they probably needed it. Don't know if I see this team doing much of anything this year. I know this team has a pretty, low-key, but pretty decently big fan base. I just don't know if I see it for this team this year. I think they needed changes, and they did not do it, so they're probably in the bottom half for me. Moving on, we have one of 2 additions from the VCT Ascension tournament, and that is Nongshim Redforce. Sin Priza Gaming was the team that won that Ascension tournament, but Nongshim Redforce bought the org, so now they have that VCT spot. They didn't make any changes to the roster, and I don't think they really needed to because they showed a lot of promise at that Ascension tournament. Going from a team that came through Premier all the way to winning Ascension, that is a very good sign to show that Premier can actually be a pretty good path to pro. Of course, their best placement in 2024 was 1st at that Ascension tournament. One thing that does concern me about this team is that they did not play in any off-season tournaments. Yes, Nongshim Redforce, the organization, did have a Tier 2 team that was playing, but as soon as they bought Sin Priza Gaming, that roster was no more. So we don't really know how these seemingly pretty promising looking players are going to perform because we haven't seen them play against any Tier 1 teams yet. But players like Ivy and Persia show a ton of potential. Persia getting 95 kills in that grand final against Boom Esports, and the rest of the roster in Dobby, Margaret, and Francis seem to be pretty promising players. Very curious to see how this roster and the other Ascension team does, but we'll get to that one later. Moving on, we have RRQ, another team that didn't make a lot of roster changes, but they did make one. Moving on from Lamar, I hope I'm saying that correctly, and adding a player by the name of Cushy. Cushy coming from a Tier 2 team by the name of Alter Ego. In terms of their best placement in 2024, they had a 5th to 6th placement at Stage 2, so they're basically one of the middle of the pack teams, a team that couldn't really get far in their own region, but was at least competitive to stay afloat through a good portion of the year. But when it came to playing against some of those top tier teams, they did crumble quite a bit. They lost teams like PaperX, they lost teams like Gen.G. So they're basically the opposite of Team Secret. They were able to beat teams that were around the same skill level or below them, but when it came to facing the top talent in the region, they did tend to crumble. They did pick up Moniette partway through the season. He was their duelist player after that, and Moniette has a lot of value in that because because he is basically a duelist slash smokes flex player. So you can put him on controller when you need it, adds a bit more roster flexibility. RQ are a team that seems to have a lot of talent, but aren't able to put together consistently top level performances. Maybe with the addition of Cushy and a bit more time for most of the roster to cook, maybe that is beneficial to them. I kind of see them in the same realm as a Talon, where I think running it back while they didn't have a roster that performed great last year, there still is some promising pieces here that maybe some more time in the oven would be beneficial to them. So really curious to see how this team ends up doing, but I still think they're going to be probably around the same spot as they were last year. Not good enough to make it to internationals, but not bad enough to be in the basement. But this region tends to have a lot of surprises. No one expected Gen.G to be good last year, so anything could happen, and maybe they're one of those teams. Moving on, we have Global Esports, who have, wow, so many player changes. It's funny because this region has like nearly, I think, 4 teams that didn't make any roster changes, and then you have Global Esports, who just got rid of everybody. In terms of players they lost, Pulvi, Bankai, Blazeking, Russ, Lightning Fast, so every single one of their players, including their Indian player in Lightning Fast. Being an Indian org, that's a debate that I've seen from fans of this team, where they want them to have Indian players, but also maybe they aren't able to get the top level talent from India. Not saying that to be negative towards Indian players, but clearly this org doesn't seem to believe in any of them to keep them, or at least try to pick up some new ones. So in terms of their brand new roster, they bring in Kelly S, Crystal, Papi Chulo, Patrick Hu, Udotan, and as an extra they brought in Darion. Their best 2024 placement was a disappointing 7th to 8th placement at Stage 1, after a disappointing year in 2023 where they were one of the worst teams in the Pacific, but still maybe there was something there. They made a lot of changes, lost players like Moniette, and they just could not put together a good roster after that. So now they bring in this new roster. They also have a new coaching staff. They brought in Elevated as one of their coaches, who seems to be a pretty smart guy when it comes to Valorant, so maybe he can help this team out a lot. And picking up a player like Crystal seems to be a pretty good decision. He played for the runner-up in the VCT Pacific Ascension Tournament in 2023 and then played for the China Ascension winner in 2024. So now he moves on to Global Esports. This is a pretty big opportunity for him. So if he wants to keep this roster spot, he's going to have to show a lot, but it seems like he's one of their better players, at least in the one off-season event that they've done so far, which was an event that the org put on themselves, and it didn't go exactly as planned for them. They ended up winning 3 out of the 5 matches. They lost to Boom Esports as well as a tier 2 team from the Philippines by the name of Neos. So that's not a great sign, but maybe they didn't do a ton of research about the teams they were faced beforehand and just wanted to see what this new roster had. This roster just kind of looks like a blender of random tier 2 players and players from different backgrounds and such, which maybe could be a good thing, but is communication going to be an issue? Is team synergy going to be an issue? Maybe this mix of players that have a lot to prove ends up working out, but I'm not too confident in their chances. It just seems like this team is a little bit cursed to just have a bad team no matter the roster, but things could change very quickly. Not super confident in their chances. I think they're still probably going to be in the basement this year, but things can change very quickly. Moving on, we have the second team added from the VCT Ascension Tournament, and that is Boom Esports, making their way into this roster because Bleed Esports broke the VCT partnership agreement, so they got kicked out, and Boom was a runner-up at the Ascension Tournament, so it just made sense. They only made one roster change in the offseason, bringing in a player by the name of DOS9 and getting rid of Zespu. The best placement in 2024 was, of course, getting second at that Ascension Tournament, right behind Sin Prissy Gaming, aka Nongshim Redforce, and they looked pretty good as well. That was a very close match that went to, I think it was like triple or quadruple overtime. It was crazy. So they could easily have been the ones that got in first, but they did get a lucky break with Bleed being a terrible org. So now it's their time to prove that they should have been that #1 Ascension team. They have a lot to prove with this incredible top crop of talent that is in this league. So they're going to need to play with a bit of fire in them if they're going to get far in this league, especially because, you know, you're now fighting Nongshim Redforce for that spot to stay in the VCT for the next year. In terms of their offseason, they only really played in 3 small events. They beat Global Esports, as already talked about, in their own event. Battle of the Sea was an event they played against Team Secret in. They lost that one, but it was just one map. And then Val ID Connects, they lost to RRQ in another one map game. So not the most to go off of when it comes to that, but not promising signs, losing to Team Secret and RRQ, teams that you're probably going to be competing with those kind of mid-range spots for. But again, one map games, things can change in any map in any match. I don't know if I see this team better as Nongshim Redforce, but I think they are, of course, very similar in skill. So I think, however, these two teams do, I think they're probably going to be pretty close to each other. I have a little bit more faith in Nongshim, but Boom Esports could prove me wrong. Moving on, we have DFM, a very interesting team from this season because last season and the year prior, this has been one of the worst teams, if not the worst team, in the entire VCT. I'll just start with their placements on this one to accentuate my point, where their best placement, the best placement that I could find for them, was a 9th to 11th placement at Stage 1. So yeah, this team was terrible, and in 2023, they didn't even win a game. They didn't win a game in the VCT Franchise League until April 9th when they won against T1, a match that they probably should have lost, but yeah, they played very well. However, that didn't start anything great for them because the only other win that they got was against Zeta Division in Stage 2. So clearly change was needed. So they end up losing 3 players and they bring in 4 more. They lose Anthem, Medusa, and Neth, and they bring in players like Akame, Art, Gwen, and Jinbon. They also don't have C's on the roster anymore, but he is listed as their sub and he recently played in an event for them. And the offseason for this new roster seems to have been going pretty well overall for this team. They did decent, not great at the Red Bull Homeground APAC play-in, but then they played in the Radiant Asia Invitational and played very well, beating teams like EDG, RRQ, Trace, PaperX. They did lose to PaperX right after that match, but still, they were able to beat them in at least one match, so maybe that's a sign of something to come. In the Riot Games Invitational event, they lost 2 out of the 3 matches that were 1-map matches, where they lost to Zeta, they lost to Fnatic, but they beat Leviathan. So again, 1-map matches aren't the best to go off of, because of course, each match in the VCT, at least during the regular season, is 3 maps. But it is at least promising that this team that has been in the basement for a very long time showed some pretty good promise at these off-season events. However, I do think I saw a lot of overreaction to that strong performance. A lot of people saying that, oh yeah, no, they are clear contenders to make it to internationals. I would hold your horses a bit, especially looking at how the offseason started to go for them, because there's a chance that maybe they were just able to catch teams off guard. And when we actually get into the season where there's more VODs on them, where people are more prepared for them, that things don't go as swimmingly. However, I will say it is great to see a team that was just absolute garbage for 2 years have a pretty strong offseason. That definitely shows a lot of promise for them. They only kept 1 player from last year's roster, and that is May, who was definitely the right decision to keep. He was very good for them last year, despite the team being pretty bad. So they recognized that change was needed. They bring in these tier 2 players, and so far the returns have been pretty good. Definitely some good signs when it comes to DFM. I'm not convinced they're going to be a great team yet. I want to see more from them. I want to see them in the VCT, but definitely much better to see that than a team that was just a guaranteed win if you're playing them. Moving on, last but not least, we have PaperX, a team that has been hitting the same drum for quite some time now. They did not make any roster changes in the offseason after what was a pretty disappointing year for the organization overall, after having some pretty high heights in 2023 where they were able to make top 3 at Tokyo, doing all that with a sub in Cigarettes when they didn't have arguably their best player at the time in something, and then going to champs with the proper roster, getting all the way to grand finals, and then being heartbroken by Evil Geniuses. And then Jane, of course, had to leave for military service. They bring in Moniette, and then Jane was able to come back, so Jane goes back in, Moniette is out, which seemed like the right decision at the time, especially considering how they performed right after that. But the best placement of the entire year was them at Madrid with Moniette, where they placed 3rd. They did get number 1 in their own region, but I think when it comes to PaperX, we have to talk about their performances at the international level, because they did not get very far in either of the last 2 tournaments of the year. Going out in disappointing fashion in playoffs after they had the choice of which team to play and picked G2, who just ran away with that match after map 1, and then losing against 100 Thieves, a team that was playing pretty hot at the time, but on paper should be able to win against. And then at Champs, it gets even worse. They end up getting grouped, losing to Edward Gaming, a team that they have been able to beat for quite some time. So it seems like this roster, while they still have a ton of talent on it, seems to be stagnating a little. Maybe the new meta is going to benefit them. With Neon getting nerfed, that leaves more room for Raze to become pretty prominent again, as well as Jet, which should be good for something. So maybe this is finally the meta that just works for PaperX and their style of play. I definitely still see this team as a top team in the region. There's no reason why they shouldn't be attending every single international like they've done for the past, I think, 3 years. It would not be the same without this team at internationals and their incredibly fun way of playing the game. I want to have faith in this team, but they have just burned me too many times. I predicted them to win, I think, 3 tournaments before, and it just has not worked out for the team. So I've sworn off predicting them to win, and ever since I swore them off, they just stopped winning. So maybe I should go back just so they at least perform well, but I just can't have the faith that I want to in a team of this talent. They still have the same coaching staff. Alex did return. They still have Forsaken. They still have Divide. They still have something. They still have Mind Freak. They still have Jane. this roster, it has to be this year. If it isn't, we're definitely going to see a change at the end of the offseason. That is my belief, which if 2025 goes similarly or worse to 2024, then it definitely would need a change. But this team is still together for a reason. They definitely can perform quite well. So this is their year to hopefully finally get it done. So that is every single team of the VCT Pacific League that will be competing in 2025. Let me know in the comment section down below what you think of all of these teams. Who do you think is going to be good? Who do you think is going to rise up and be a dark horse? And who is going to be, maybe falling from grace? Please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next one. Bye.